The first time Luke Callahan died, it was under a sky so wide, it made a man feel small enough to fit in his own coffin. The bullet caught him just below the ribs, hot as a branding iron, and twice as cruel. He remembered the sound more than the pain. The crack of a rifle echoing off the red bluffs like thunder rolling across Judgment Day. He dropped from the saddle and hit the dirt of Dry Creek Valley face first, tasting iron and dust, figuring that was the last flavor he'd ever know. The outlaw gang he'd been trailing rode off laughing, leaving him bleeding into the thirsty earth, and the sun hung high and merciless above him, like it was waiting to watch him fade. Luke had made a name for himself from Abilene clear down to the border, a bounty hunter with steady hands and a colder stare. He didn't scare easy, and he didn't forgive quicker than he shot. Folks said he was carved from mesquite and mean intentions, but that afternoon, as his blood soaked into the sand, he realized even hard men break. He tried to crawl, but his arms buckled like rotten fence posts. The world blurred at the edges, and he thought about the promises he'd never kept, the ranch he'd meant to buy, the quiet life he'd sworn he'd try someday. He laughed once, weak and bitter, guessed the West had other plans. He might have drifted straight into the arms of the Almighty, if not for the sound of hooves cutting through the wind. Steady and sure, he forced one eye open and saw a rider against the sun, a silhouette framed in gold light. He thought it was an angel at first, or maybe death wearing a hat. The horse stopped beside him, and a woman's voice floated down, low and firm. "You aiming to die out here, mister, or you planning on fighting for it?" Luke tried to answer but coughed blood instead. The rider dismounted with the ease of someone born to the saddle, boots hitting the dirt without hesitation. Her name was Clara Whitmore, though he didn't learn that until later. At that moment she was just a pair of steady hands pressing against his wound, tearing fabric from her own skirt to bind him tight. She moved fast, not frantic, the way folks do when they've seen hurt before and decided not to fear it. Her hair was the color of dark chestnut, pulled back tight beneath a worn hat, and her eyes were the sharp blue of mountain ice. She checked the horizon once, calculating risk, then hauled him up with a strength that surprised him. "You're not dying today," she muttered, as if it were a personal command to the universe. Clara lived alone on a small ranch tucked between cottonwoods and a narrow bend of river, a place most maps forgot and most men never found. She got Luke onto her wagon by grit and stubbornness alone, driving through twilight with one hand on the reins and the other pressing cloth to his side. She didn't ask who he was or what trouble followed him. Out here, survival came before stories. By the time they reached her cabin, the moon had risen silver and watchful. She dragged him inside, laid him on her kitchen table, and lit every lamp she owned. The bullet was still lodged deep, and Luke drifted in and out while she worked. He felt the burn of whiskey poured into the wound, heard her whisper something that might have been a prayer or a curse. He nearly blacked out when she dug the slug free, but her voice kept pulling him back, steady as a lasso around his fading mind. "Stay with me, cowboy. I didn't haul you across 5 miles of bad road to lose you now." When it was done, she stitched him up with hands that trembled only once, then sat back in her chair, sweat glistening on her brow, as if she'd just wrestled the devil and won. Luke woke 2 days later to the smell of coffee and the faint crackle of a fire. The pain in his side was sharp but clean, the kind that promised healing instead of death. Clara sat by the window whittling a piece of wood, rifle within reach, as sunlight poured across the wooden floorboards. She looked over when he stirred, eyes measuring him the way a rancher measures weather. "You're hard to kill," she said plainly. He studied her, confusion mixing with gratitude he wasn't used to feeling. "Why?" he rasped. That single word held all his suspicion, all his disbelief that someone would save a stranger bleeding in the dirt. She set the knife down and met his gaze without flinching. "Because I could," she answered, as if it were the simplest truth in the world. "And because no one deserves to die alone in the dust." Luke had no reply for that. In his world, kindness came with a price, and mercy was usually a lie wearing perfume. Yet there she was, real as the sunrise, having wagered her safety on a man she didn't know. As he lay back against her pillow, listening to the quiet rhythm of ranch life outside, Luke Callahan made a vow he didn't speak aloud. If he lived through this, he'd repay that debt. Not in coin, not in favors, but in something stronger. Something that would last longer than bullets, and longer than dust. Luke stayed longer than he meant to, healing slow beneath Clara Whitmore's steady watch. The wound closed in weeks, but something else opened in him without permission. He fixed her fences before she asked, chopped her wood without complaint, and rode the pasture at dawn like he'd been born to that stretch of land. Clara never pressed him for his past, though she knew by the way he scanned the horizon that trouble wasn't a thing he'd left behind. It came one late afternoon in a cloud of dust. 3 riders cutting across the ridge like wolves who'd caught a scent. Luke saw them first, and the blood in his veins ran cold as riverstone. He recognized the lead rider by the tilt of his hat and the scar that cut his cheek in two. Jeremiah Crowe, a man who'd once sworn to bury Luke under the same sky they'd robbed together. Crowe had a memory long as winter and a temper twice as cruel. "Well, I'll be damned," Crowe called out as they pulled up near the fence. "Callahan, I knew you weren't dead. You never did know how to stay buried." Clara stepped onto the porch with her rifle cradled in her arms, posture straight and fearless. She didn't ask who they were, just said, calm as still water, "You boys got business here, or you just admiring my land?" Luke felt something twist in his chest that had nothing to do with his half-healed wound. Crowe's eyes slid to Clara, slow and calculating, the way a gambler studies a fresh deck. "We've got business with him," he said, nodding at Luke. "He owes us something fierce." Luke moved down the steps to stand a little ahead of Clara, subtle but clear, a shield whether she wanted one or not. "Debt's mine," Luke answered, voice low and dangerous. "Has nothing to do with her." Crowe smiled, thin as barbed wire. "Everything's got to do with whoever's standing closest." The threat hung in the air, thick as summer heat. Clara shifted her grip on the rifle, but didn't step back, and Luke realized in that moment she was braver than half the men he'd ridden with in his worst years. The standoff broke like lightning. Crowe's man reached first, and Luke was faster. Even wounded, even stiff, he drew and fired in one smooth motion, the shot cracking across the valley. One rider fell, the other bolted, and Crowe wheeled his horse hard, cursing as he retreated toward the hills. "This ain't finished, Callahan," he shouted back. "You can't hide behind a woman forever." Dust swallowed them soon after, leaving silence and the sharp smell of gunpowder behind. Luke stood still, heart pounding, knowing the truth of it. Crowe wasn't the kind of man who let grudges die quiet. Clara lowered her rifle, slow eyes steady on Luke. "You planning on telling me who that was?" she asked, not angry, just direct. Luke holstered his gun and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "A ghost I should have buried proper," he replied. He told her then about the jobs he'd taken when he was younger, the banks robbed under false names, the nights spent running instead of sleeping. He told her how he'd walked away after one job went wrong and left men dead who shouldn't have been there. Crowe had called it betrayal. Luke had called it survival. Clara listened without interrupting, hands folded on the porch rail. When he finished, the wind stirred her hair loose around her face. She studied him long enough to make him uncomfortable. "You done with that life?" she asked at last. Luke met her gaze and didn't look away. "I was done before you found me in the dirt," he said. "Just didn't know what I was riding toward instead." She nodded once, accepting the answer for what it was. "Then you don't get to run," she said quietly. "Not from them, not from this." He understood what she meant. If Crowe wanted him, Crowe would come through her land to get him, and Luke would not be the reason she paid in blood. That night they sat at the kitchen table with maps spread wide, plotting ridgelines and river crossings like generals planning war. Clara knew every bend of the valley, every narrow pass where a man could hide or make a stand. Luke traced possible approaches with a calloused finger, calculating angles and timing. He should have left. That would have been the simplest answer. Draw Crowe away and spare her ranch the fight. But the thought of riding off while danger stalked her fields felt like cowardice, worse than any outlaw brand he'd worn before. Somewhere between strategy and silence, his hand brushed hers. Neither of them pulled away quick. Just before dawn, Luke stepped outside and watched the sky lighten from black to bruised purple. Clara joined him with 2 cups of coffee, steam curling into the cold air. "You don't owe me your life," she said without looking at him. "I did what anyone should." Luke shook his head slow. "No, you didn't," he replied. "Most folks would have let the coyotes finish the job." He turned to face her fully, the promise forming stronger than steel inside him. "You saved my life, Clara Whitmore, and I'm not paying that back with money or thanks. I'm paying it back by standing between you and every storm that rides this way, for as long as I've got breath." She searched his face for doubt, and found none. The sun broke over the horizon just then, bathing the valley in gold, and for the first time in years Luke Callahan felt like a man riding toward something worth fighting for, not away from it. Jeremiah Crowe came back with the kind of sunrise that promises blood. A red streak cut the eastern sky as Luke spotted riders cresting the northern ridge. 5 this time, moving in a tight line like men who meant to finish what they started. The valley lay quiet beneath the early light, cottonwoods still and the river whispering soft as prayer. Clara stood beside Luke near the barn, rifle resting easy against her shoulder. "He brought more friends," she said, calm as ever. Luke nodded once, jaw set. "Means he's scared," he answered, though he knew fear made Crowe meaner, not weaker. They moved like two halves of the same thought. Clara taking the high ground near the split-rail fence, Luke circling wide to draw fire away from the house. The first shot cracked across the pasture, and the fight was on. Horses screamed, bullets chewed at wood and dirt, smoke stung the air sharp and bitter. Luke felt the old instincts return, cold and precise. But this time they weren't fueled by greed or anger. They were driven by something steadier. He fought not for escape, but for the woman who had pulled him back from death's doorstep without asking his name. Every step he took was deliberate, every shot measured, because this land was hers and he meant to keep it standing. Crowe rode straight for the cabin, reckless as wildfire. Luke saw it and cut across the field, shouting Clara's name, though he knew she didn't frighten easy. A bullet grazed his arm, hot and slicing, but he barely felt it. He reached the porch just as Crowe swung down from his saddle. Gun raised, the two men locked eyes across the yard, years of unfinished business burning between them. He should have stayed dead. Crowe spat. Luke leveled his revolver. "Steady as sunrise." "I did," he answered. "She brought me back." The shots rang out almost together, echoing hard against the bluffs. When the smoke cleared, Crowe lay in the dirt he'd meant for Luke, eyes staring at a sky that offered no mercy. The remaining riders scattered like crows chased from a field, leaving silence to settle slow and heavy. Luke stood swaying on his feet, breath ragged, until Clara's hand found his arm. Grounding him, she looked him over quick, checking for blood not already his. "You always make things dramatic," she murmured, relief flickering behind her steady gaze. He managed a crooked smile. "Figured I owed you a proper ending." The wind picked up gentle and warm, carrying away the last of the gun smoke, like a curtain falling on an old life. They buried the dead beyond the ridge before noon, not out of kindness but out of necessity. The valley felt different after that, lighter somehow, as if a long shadow had finally lifted. Luke stood beside the fresh mound of earth where Crowe rested and felt no triumph, only closure. The past had come riding and been laid to rest, and for the first time since he was a young man chasing fast money and faster trouble, he wasn't looking over his shoulder. Clara joined him there, hat tipped back, eyes on the horizon that no longer seemed threatening. That evening, as the sun bled gold into the river, Luke sat on the porch steps turning something small and silver in his fingers. It wasn't much, just a simple ring he'd carried for years, without knowing why. Maybe once meant for a dream he'd long abandoned. Clara stepped out with 2 plates of supper, and paused when she saw the look on his face. "You aiming to ask me something, Callahan?" she said, half amused, half knowing. He stood slow, nerves tightening in a way gunfights never had. "You saved my life once," he began, voice rough but steady. "I've been paying that back every day since, but I figure I could spend the rest of my years trying and still not square the ledger." He held out the ring between them. "Not grand, not flashy, just honest. So instead of paying it back, maybe I stay and build something with you. Something that don't end when the shooting does." Clara looked at the ring, then at him, measuring his words the way she measured weather and cattle and risk. "You sure you're not just grateful?" she asked softly. Luke shook his head, stepping closer. "Grateful fades," he said. "What I feel don't." For a long moment the world seemed to hold its breath with him. Clara slipped the ring onto her finger without another word, and that was answer enough. She rested her forehead against his, the valley stretching wide and endless behind them. "You don't owe me anymore," she whispered. "You're choosing me." Luke wrapped his arms around her, holding on like a man who'd nearly lost everything once and refused to do so again. The West would always be wild, storms would roll in, and fences would break, and work would never truly end. But love, he'd learned, was stronger than bullets and steadier than fear. She had saved his life once in a valley of dust and dying light, and he would spend forever not repaying the debt, but living it, riding beside her through every sunrise the wide sky chose to give them.